Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Michael Moody, and I am the Fry Foundation Chair for Family Philanthropy here at the Johnson Center. And we'd like to welcome you to this webinar, which is titled, What We Don't Know, How Gaps in Giving Data Could Impact Our Sector. This webinar is part of the Johnson Center's mission, which is to understand, strengthen, and advance philanthropy, and specifically through connecting research to practice to improve philanthropy's vital role that it plays in our communities. And this is also specifically tied to a particular focus that we have for a few months that we're calling Field Focus. And this current field focus is around the uses of data in our sector, and I'll give you a connection to that at the end of the webinar, where you can find out more on our website. Just a reminder to everybody that you all are on mute as participants. When you do want to ask a question, there will be a time at the end where we will love to take your questions, but you can offer those questions at any time throughout the webinar by clicking on the button. There should be a button on your screen that will take you to a chat box and enter your questions there. Again, you can do that at any point. If you would like to give a question specifically to a particular presenter, indicate that in your question. Otherwise, the presenters will decide who can best answer the question. But before that, we're going to have I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're discussing, and then when each of our three panelists will talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have that Q&A, so we have plenty of time for that. So what we're talking about today is, as you know, if you haven't noticed, it's tax week. And this is the last tax week before the new tax law that was passed last year kicks in. And we've heard a lot in our field about mostly negative things about the consequences of that new tax law on the impacts on charitable giving. But there's a lot that we don't know about how that's going to affect giving. We don't know how those millions of people who will no longer itemize, how they're going to change their giving, how the people who will still itemize and have incentives to give from taxes will continue to give, will they give more, and also those people who have the benefit of the estate tax changes, those people who are receiving that money through the intergenerational wealth transfer, whether they will give and how they will give. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and of course it's data, new and more and better data, that's required to answer that uncertainty. But the tax law is not the only thing that's leading us to ask for more, and we need more data on philanthropy giving in the nonprofit sector. The philanthropic world itself is diversifying in ways that will fundamentally change the sector and the institutions that operate in it, about what the sector funds, who works in the institutions, how it works with particular communities. We also know that more and more of the bigger donors are using donor-advised funds, a vehicle that about which we have much less available data than we do, say, about private foundations. And of course, the 2020 census is coming up. And while we know that the consequences of that census are tremendously impactful for, say, federal dollars going to various states and communities, but it also is going to impact philanthropy. It impacts philanthropy in the sense that the data about community poverty, for example, or the racial ethnic makeup of certain neighborhoods is used to direct philanthropic dollars to certain communities, and it has tremendous impact on data-driven decision-making in philanthropy as well. The point is that all of these changes require more and better data in order for us to do better giving and to support the nonprofit sector and nonprofit organizations in the way that we all want to. We believe very seriously that data needs to be used to inform policy about the sector and policy about the issues that nonprofits work on. Data should inform donor and grant-making decisions, how philanthropy serves particular populations, particularly disadvantaged communities, the efforts to increase the diversity, equity, inclusion that's in the sector, and more and more. So there's many things that are impacted by data, and the challenge is that data has always been difficult to gather on giving and the nonprofit sector, and some of these trends, as well as some changes in funding in the field, are making it even harder for us to get that data. And so that's really the gap that we're talking about, that we're going to address in this webinar. And to do so, we have a stellar panel of three individuals who have different but very complementary expertise and are working in various ways to help bridge this gap to use data to improve our understanding and improve the impact of the sector. So let me talk a bit about who these three panelists are, and then we'll turn it over to the first of them to begin. So presenting alphabetically, we have first Elizabeth Boris, who's currently Institute Fellow at the Urban Institute. And for 20 years, Elizabeth founded and ran the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy at the Urban Institute, which is, most of you might know, one of the premier and most respected sources of data in this field. Next will be Eric Guthrie, who's here in the room with me. He's the state demographer of Michigan, and in this role, he also serves as the state's liaison to the U.S. Census Bureau, which is an important role, of course, for us. And third, but of course not last but not least, is Jasmine McGinnis-Johnson on the line. Jasmine is assistant professor in public administration and public policy at George Washington University, where she studies the management and governance of nonprofit sector and philanthropic organizations. So I'm going to turn first to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you've been at the forefront of the data collection about this sector for decades, really, and so it's important for us to hear what's your assessment of the current changes in our data sources and our data infrastructure, and why do these changes matter? What impact will they have on those of us who need good data, and why is this data, really reliable data, important? What sources of data are going away or shrinking, and what might be some new sources, hopefully, that can help in the future. So I'll turn it over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Michael. It's a great honor to be a participant on this webinar with my distinguished colleagues, and I want to thank you and Tori for making it possible. It's always fun to talk about something that you're passionate about. So my major effort has been for my whole career trying to promote better data on the nonprofit sector and philanthropy. Sometimes I ask myself why, and so I'm going to tell you some of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of better data. So let's see if I can get this slide to come up. There we go. So when I think about data for the nonprofit sector, I think about what we need to know in order to place ourselves in our environment, the trends that affect organizations and people in our communities, the nation, and the world. We need to understand our sector, its scope, its dimensions, its finances, so that we can understand our role vis-a-vis other actors in our society. We need answers to what I call big questions about ourselves, not only about our environment, but what are our achievements, impacts, how are we innovating? I have up here about 7 boxes, but there's many, many more I think that you could add as well. What works and why? We don't have a lot of good data on that. We have evaluations, but getting at the core of and sharing the findings from those evaluations turns out to be pretty difficult. Our relationships with government and business, these are things that we try to study, but still we're in our infancy in some of these relationships. Donor and volunteer motivations, which I know many of you are concerned about. We'll talk a little bit more about as I go on. But we're still struggling to understand under what circumstances donors give and volunteers volunteer. Advocacy and social change, very important for our role in our society. Our research on that is advancing, but still, I would say, pretty primitive. Regulation and self-regulation. I've been working on studying state regulatory efforts, and I would say that we have a dearth of information on that. And then I think we often neglect the social capital building and civic roles of nonprofits. I think that these are really important efforts that we need to be aware of and promoting. So in addition to the big impacts, we need data for day-to-day management and leadership. We need to understand how to make our organizations have the impact and be sustainable over time. And data and information and research are all important in that effort. Management and administration, which Jasmine does. Governance, we have some information on governance, but we have a long way to go to understand who governs and the relationship of diversity to governance. Leadership and staffing, I think we have good data on how many staff, but we're still in denial, I think, about the kinds of staff and what interesting patterns emerge when you have more diverse staff in terms of not only race and ethnicity, but also class. Our finances, I think we have pretty good information on finances and commercial revenues and expenses, but we still don't have great understanding in the field about how important it is to have appropriate overhead and how that is important to the way our organizations run. Giving and volunteering, we have come a long way, but still our giving data is precarious, especially with the Tax Reform Act, which I'll talk about. And then infrastructure and capacity. We also are in denial about the lack of capacity in many of our philanthropic institutions and really don't understand what it would take, or maybe we understand what it would take, but maybe we don't have the will and the financing to get them up to where they need to be sustainable and to have the kind of impact that they need to have. When I think about data in our field, it's like a lot of other things in our society. It's rather an underfunded infrastructure. It's that invisible part. It's always hard to raise money for data on our sector. If you talk about the National Center for Charitable Statistics, which was a part of the center that I ran, and GuideStar and the Foundation Center, it's always been a struggle for us to access data from the government, pay for cleaning it and making it available. Now, in the new era, we're really going to have digitized data from Forms 990, and that will be much less expensive, but we still need the resources to make it accessible online and to the organizations that need it. Let's go to the, so what do I see as some of the gaps in our data? Well, if we think about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it's really going to impact the itemizers, as Michael mentioned. And we get a lot of our information from that itemizer data, because those are where actual people have to put on their tax form, what they gave. Now, we supplement that with surveys and information from other sources, but that cut in our data is really going to have a potential impact on our sector. Other things that are coming down the line, and you may have noticed that the President's budget proposed eliminating the Corporation for National Community Service. That will not only have an impact on, that would, if it were to be enacted, have an impact on our whole volunteering community, but also the data that we have on giving and volunteering that the Corporation for National Community Service makes available to us. It took us many, many years to get the corporation to help us add questions on giving and volunteering to the census. And if they were to go away, we're not sure what would happen to that data. And then there's inherent difficulty in tracking digital and online giving. Giving that is more informal and that has an impact on our sector, but we don't have good data. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But getting the folks to collect that information through software firms and on online platforms is a big job, getting that collaboration going. But I think it's necessary for us to really track that more effectively. The era of big data is here, but we have to be able to capture and use that information and make it accessible to other folks. Right now, the big thing that I've been working on for many of the 20 years is to get electronically filed Forms 990 so that we could have in digital form everything on those 990s, except for giving data, which is private, so that we could more easily track the trends in our sector. The big step forward now has been with the organization, with the Aspen Institute's Data Collaborative. We've been promoting electronic files of Form 990, and there's a House Bill 5433, if you want to register and promote it, that would make electronic filing of Forms 990 mandatory and would give us access to so much more data than we have currently. We also have a dearth of information on donor-advised funds, which is improving. We have a report out from the Indiana Center on Philanthropy on donor-advised funds. Some of the providers of donor-advised funds are providing information. But still, I think that the sense is that that's still kind of a black hole, and we need more information on it in terms of giving. The Bureau of Labor Statistics provides information on employment, and the Johns Hopkins Center does a good job of making that available. It has a new interactive website, but it doesn't cover nonprofits that are small with fewer than 4 individuals. So there is a lack there that we have to fill with Form 990 data and other information, surveys, et cetera. We're about to lose the Boston College Wealth Transfer, I guess we've lost it, the Boston College Wealth Transfer Report, which would update us every so many years on the transfer of wealth from one generation to another. I don't know of anyone that's going to fill that gap, but that's an important loss for our sector. Let's go on and talk about donor motivation, something that those of us who study the nonprofit sector are really very keen to understand better. And the Gates Foundation is doing some heroic work in trying to do some experimental work, supporting some qualitative and quantitative studies. But we need much more work in this area to try to understand across the diversity of cultures and regional differences why people give and why certain areas of the country seem to give much more than others, the impact of religion and other factors in their giving. And as we know, giving and volunteering go hand in hand. Sometimes we don't think as much about volunteering as I think we should, because there are billions of dollars worth of hours that are provided to nonprofit organizations through volunteering. In our next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about the tax reform impacts. The Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center here at the Urban Institute has a model, and this is another area where we need much more work, I think, in terms of data. Models that build in the charitable sector into the big economic models and into the tax policy models. The Tax Policy Center does that, but it has to be kept up year after year. So what we know is that as a result of the tax policy change, we're going to have fewer itemizers, which I mentioned. Nationally, households that are claiming itemized deductions will drop from 37 million to 16 million. So you can imagine the decrease in data that we're going to have on those high-income itemizing taxpayers. It's going to be a terrific blow to our ability to understand what's going on in giving. And it also may change tax-motivated giving behavior. So the lower individual tax rate will reduce the marginal tax benefit of charitable giving, about 5% on average. It's also possibly going to, the estate tax exemption, which doubled to 22 million, may also discourage tax-motivated bequests. So we have some very important things that are happening in our society and also in our nonprofit sector environment that are going to affect giving. And we're not going to have the data at hand to really estimate and develop information on the trends unless we start supporting this data infrastructure. So let's talk a few minutes about informal and online giving. There's a lot of that going on with social media, and in such things as see if I can find this, social media, global giving, online giving. We have good information from the global giving sites. We don't have so much information from information that nonprofits collect online. We're trying to get a better handle on those things. Giving Tuesday, for example, we'd like to know more about how Giving Tuesday affects giving, not only in this country but around the world. We piece it together, but if we had more coordinated and collaborative data sharing, we might be able to know more about how crowdfunding works, how MoveOn.org works, giving circles, Network for Good. And so we have wonderful things going on in our communities and in our nation, and actually worldwide, but our ability to track and learn and sustain our organizations by really following what works and what doesn't work is limited at this point. So our decrease in high-quality data from tax itemizers is going to be a great loss to the field, and it will hinder our ability to assess giving trends, both to monitor the health of the sector and to plan for the future. I want to emphasize that planning for the future and the health of the sector. I think those are our key issues. So how can we maybe fill some of these gaps? Well, we have historical tax data that's going to help with some giving estimates. We have some online and survey data from the studies that Indiana University does, $1 Million Givers and the panel study of income dynamics. But we're going to have to really watch the trends and try to get on top of what's going to happen in the next year or so. There's also collaborative efforts like the Growth in Giving Fundraising Effectiveness Projects, of which I am the chair of the steering committee, and we're trying to provide robust giving data from software providers. We've been working on this for a number of years now, and it just seems to be at a point where more software providers are willing to provide their data. But that's not going to take the place of the itemizer data for high-income donors. That's still going to be a gap. However, we're going to be able to follow trends in thousands and thousands of givers and many hundreds of thousands of actual giving events. So I'm very excited about the potential of that particular effort. It's a possibility, but probably a very long shot. The giving data reported on Forms 990 is not public information, but perhaps we could have an effort to make the IRS provide, or ask the IRS, we don't make the IRS do anything, provide access to anonymized versions of that data. That might help us to fill some of the gaps that we are looking forward, or not looking forward to, but we anticipate. And then perhaps nonprofits that receive large gifts could be persuaded to report them to some sort of a central database. So we do have gaps. We do have things that we can be working toward. My bottom line is we have a vibrant, diverse, and growing civil society, but our knowledge base is still fairly primitive, especially at the state and local levels. The new data infrastructure in progress. We have state charity officials who have been trying to get access to Form 990 information. They've been working toward a shared platform, and that is now taking place with GuideStar, CityBase, and the National Association of State Charity Officials. This is going to permit better information on and better oversight of the sector. Then we have a budding effort by nonprofit scholars to develop a nonprofit panel data project where researchers around the country are going to be asking the same questions on local surveys and data projects, and then working to bring that data together so that we have a better, more fine-grained information on nonprofits and philanthropy around the country. It's just in its beginning stages. And then something that I'm also affiliated with is Fourth Sector Initiative. We're building a data commons that will collect information on for-benefit organizations, those hybrid for-profit, nonprofit organizations that have a social purpose but rely on commercial revenue. So I just want to thank you for allowing me to be part of this, effort today to bring information about our data and the needs we have. So thank you, Michael.
Great, thanks so much, Elizabeth. I do like that at the end you're talking about some efforts that are actually trying to address the gap in a positive way. So gives us a little bit of hope, which is great, which is always useful. And I just want to remind everybody on the call that you can be asking questions throughout the webinar. You just click on the chat button and put your question in there, and we'll make sure that it gets queued up for the Q&A, which is going to come at the end. But we turn now to Eric Guthrie, who, again, State Demographer of Michigan. So Eric, as a public service data practitioner, can you explain the kinds of data that you gather and or that you use to analyze and to provide reports, and how you see that data being used by communities, by nonprofits, by governments? And then specifically, what are those challenges facing our upcoming 2020 census, and what would be the consequences for those nonprofits, communities, policymakers, et cetera, of a less than stellar effort in that upcoming census? So over to you, Eric.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to everyone about the data that we use in the public sector to help everyone make decisions and understand the world around them. As mentioned, I'm the state demographer for Michigan. I know that we have a national and international audience on the line, so as far as what I'm going to be talking about today in terms of the public data that is available for the sector, there's somebody in almost every state of the nation that fills my role. They may not have the same title as I do, but there's somebody in your state that's there to help you. If you were to go onto Google and Google Census State Data Center, for example, you're going to get a list of resources of people in your states that are going to be able to help you access data, use data, and understand what data are appropriate for answering what questions. So as the state demographer for Michigan, the role that I feel is that of an applied demographer. So I don't go out and do a lot of primary research. There's some of that, but mostly what I do is help the state, the citizens of the state, local leaders, business leaders, nonprofit practitioners, understand the world around them, right, and answer questions to help them do the work that they're doing. And to do that, there are a wide variety of data sets available and that we use quite often. When we talk about the types of data, the first and probably the most important for a number of reasons is the decennial census. These data are used for redistricting, right? So when we talk about our political power, about our representation in terms of understanding where people are, this is vitally important. These data are used for funding allocations, right? So when we're talking about the literally hundreds of billions of dollars that the federal government uses or disperses to the states to use to run programs every year, a lot of these data are based either directly on decennial census data or are controlled to these totals with data sets that are produced throughout the decade. But beyond those federal dollars that are allocated using these funds, we have to remember also that there are billions of dollars worth of state dollars that are funded, that are allocated based on census data. And I work with people from the philanthropic and nonprofit sector really on a daily basis to help them in terms of writing grant proposals, in terms of figuring out how to disperse their funds, and a lot of times those decisions are also based on decennial census data. So what we're really talking about are enormous pots of money that are based on this once-in-a-decade data collection procedure. And really when we think about the monumental effort that it takes to collect this data and why it costs so much to collect, and I'll talk about more about that in a moment or two, the decennial census is the largest peacetime mobilization of the federal government every year, and it's so large that if you're looking at labor statistics, you can see spikes in employment that occur as a result of the census every year. So in terms of funding allocations, we really cannot overemphasize how important these data are. As I mentioned, they serve as the base for estimates that are produced and used throughout the decade. This includes what I'm going to talk about in a moment, population estimates, but it also includes other federal programs. When we talk about other federal data sources, to make sure that we don't have varying estimates of the population, most of those estimates are controlled back to an official population number, and the source for those official population numbers is this decennial census. And anytime that there are any decisions, whether it be funding or anything else, where official counts are needed, those go back to the decennial census. When we're talking about official counts that are used in years not ending in zero, we're talking about the population estimates, which is another important source of data that I use often to help people answer questions. These are the official population estimates that are used in years that don't end in zero. And there are two types of population estimates that we use frequently. There are post-census estimates. These estimates are produced every year. And so every year after the Census Bureau collects from the states, and this is something, one data collection procedure that I do and provide to the Census Bureau is we collect information on group quarter housing, births, deaths throughout that have occurred over the year. We send those to Census, and they use those types of data to refigure what the population is estimated to be in those years. So every year that doesn't end in zero, a new estimate set is produced, and it replaces the previous estimate set that was produced after the census, and those serve as the official estimates of the population. After every census, the previous 10 years worth of post-census estimates are refigured, right? And those are the inter-census estimates, and those replace the last vintage of the post-census estimates and become the official estimate of the population for that decade, and those do not then get revised at any later point. And the reason that's important is because if we want to understand trends that are occurring over time, we have to have a continuous set of population estimates that allow us to understand those trends and understand both where populations are increasing and where populations are decreasing. Another type of data, and probably the data set that I use most often, is the American Community Survey, or the ACS. The American Community Survey, the data were first published for this particular data set in 2005, and the American Community Survey replaced what used to be the long form on the decennial census. The long form was the sample form that 1% of the population got with their decennial census, and it collected all of the interesting information, right? More than just the population count. It collected data on income, on poverty, on ancestry, and all of those characteristics data, right? The ACS replaced that long form and allows us to have data not just once every 10 years, but on a continuing basis throughout the decade. So every year a new set, actually two new sets of ACS data are released. They're the one-year estimates, which are released for any area that have a population greater than 65,000. And then there are the 5-year estimates, which are pooled estimates that are released really for every geography in the nation. So down to the smallest town or village, actually down to the block group that may be smaller than those towns and villages. So, and again, by releasing these data annually, we get data much more often than used to be the case when data were only released every 10 years. To access these data, there are an enormous number of summary tables that are produced, and those summary tables take the data that are collected through the American Community Survey and really provide wonderful geographic granularity in terms of allowing people to create custom regions if they're interested in, and have really a great amount of geographically precise data on a whole wealth of topics. Another data set that's produced through the American Community Survey are the public use microdata samples. Now, the difference really is with the PUMS data, and a shout out to our colleagues in Minnesota through University of Minnesota. They actually serve to make these data very accessible through the iPUMS program. These data allow us to create custom tabulations where we can really get down to really interesting subpopulations. So if you wanted to know something about a group, say for example you needed to have a very specific age range for persons that are in poverty or something like that, you could get these from these PUMS microdata. The difference between the summary data and the PUMS data, well, the PUMS data you need a little bit more statistical knowledge to understand how to work with it because it is a sample of the microdata, but they're geographically limited. So the PUMS data are available for areas that have a population of at least 100,000 people. And those areas are redefined every 10 years after the decennial census by the folks in the state data centers. So whereas with the summary data you can get down and create your own custom regions and really dig into the data that way. The PUMS data you can't really create your own custom regions as well, but you can really dig in and get very interesting data about a lot of subpopulations. And again, this is probably the data set that I use most often to help people because of just the richness of it. Other data sets that I use frequently and people find very interesting, one would be the Current Population Survey, or the CPS. This is a very good survey. The issue with it is the sample size isn't quite as large as the it's not nearly as large as the American Community Survey. So as far as getting down to anything really below, it's great for national statistics and it's pretty good for state statistics. Anything sub-state, because the sample size starts to become problematic. But the real benefit of the CPS is its currency. It is very current. Data are released for this particular survey on a monthly basis. So right now, we're dealing with data that was collected in February or March. Okay, very current. I don't use IRS tax data a whole lot. The one area that I do use IRS tax data is when I'm trying to help people, or when I'm producing population projections. I need to understand migration trends. These data are very valuable for understanding migration rates, and not only do I use it, but also the U.S. Census Bureau uses it for determining migration rates in the annual population estimates. I also use vital statistics that are collected at the state level, and these are, again, for population projections, determining birth rates, determining mortality rates. When we get to move beyond the types of data that we use, it's also important to understand the challenges that are affecting these data. Proper funding is a tremendous challenge. When we think about how expensive it is to collect the decennial census and how those issues with funding have been compounded over this decade, and we've seen things like tests of the census being canceled, and really there is great concern about the functioning of some of the decennial census programs because of the lack of funding that we've seen over the previous decade. After the 2010 census, which was the most expensive census that has ever been conducted, Congress told the Census Bureau to conduct the 2020 census for the same amount or less than the 2010 census, not adjusting for inflation. Right? So what that means is the census was mandated to conduct it for less than the 2010 census because, of course, inflation happens. They've been working on doing that with a variety of technological innovations, use of administrative records, but the testing for some of those things, because of the fundings that they've received, have been cut short, and it's really causing some concerns in the data community. Race and citizenship questions. The Census Bureau recommended a change to the race question that the Office of Management and Budget decided not to act on. That was a concerning lack of action that caused a real impact in data collection. And now, recently, we've heard that they're considering adding a citizenship question. It's looking more and more likely like that's going to happen. We're really concerned about response rates with that. We know that there are hard-to-count populations in the census, and adequate funding and testing is necessary to make sure that those populations are adequately represented. Remember that when we talk about the census, we're talking about representation, not only representation in our political system, but also representation in public. It's difficult to advocate for a community if you don't have data on that community, if you don't know that that community is there. Okay. And also, some of the challenges come around the Census Bureau's plan to use administrative records. They're moving forward with that, and some of us in the data community have concerns about some of the plans for that particular implementation. As far as topics that I personally find difficult to help folks get answers to, questions around wealth are definitionally difficult to answer. Especially when we're talking about losing data sets that have been collecting and publishing those types of data. The government collects data on income, the data collects information on wages, but that is different from wealth. Right? Wealth is a difficult topic to talk about. Rurality and urbanity are also difficult topics to address, just because, again, there's definitional problems with those particular topics. The USDA put out a paper some years ago that was over 100 pages long, just trying to define the term rural. Right? It means different things to different people, and unless you actually understand the question you're trying to answer, that can be very, very difficult. Questions on very specific subgroups are also sometimes difficult to answer. But we do the best we can. But if the subgroup is very small, especially if it's very geographically isolated, it can be very, very difficult to answer. And questions on very small or sparsely populated areas can also be very difficult to answer with public data. I do work quite a bit with the philanthropic and nonprofit communities. I'm very involved with the Michigan Nonprofit Association's work surrounding the 2020 census, and I have to really thank them for all the excellent work that they've been doing around that particular data collection effort. I also speak frequently with nonprofit groups, in terms of helping them and advising them. And I just wanted to mention one thing that I heard Elizabeth talk about was with the elimination of that appropriation in the president's budget. If there is data that is being collected because that group advocated for it, the Census Bureau doesn't collect data just because they want to collect data. There needs to be a federal need. There needs to be a need for those data. And so in the future, if that federal need disappears, then those questions might also disappear, right? So that's important to keep in mind for the community as well. So that's what I have.
Great. Thank you so much. It's really useful to get that from a state perspective, I think, and because again, this is something, and I think it's also always useful for us to talk about as the census come up, just how much consequence there is of those census counts, because it's significant, millions of dollars in federal dollars, as well as billions of dollars of federal, I've just been corrected, billions of dollars in federal allocations as a result of that, as well as, of course, not even counting all the philanthropic dollars and other things that happen as a result. So reminder again to the participants that you would like, please ask your questions, and if you have specific questions for presenters, put that in the question, but you can be asking your questions now rather than waiting till the end. And we then turn to our final presenter, who is Jasmine. Jasmine, your work focuses on diversity, equity, inclusion in philanthropy in the nonprofit sector, including gender disparities and efforts to increase the racial and ethnic diversity in philanthropic organizations and nonprofit organizations. So maybe talk about how your work is affected by the lack of good data on those specific diversity aspects of the sector. What data exists, and what data do we need to answer those questions better? And then what are the specific consequences of this lack of good demographic and diversity data? What are those challenges in collecting that more data to be able to answer those questions better? So over to you, Jasmine.
Thanks, Mike, for having me. And I'm so glad that I have two colleagues, Elizabeth, to set me up, because many of the challenges and opportunities that each presenter has discussed are definitely present, and maybe even more so when we start talking about diversity in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. So one sort of caveat that I want to start with is I want to define diversity in a way that makes sense for the research and sort of data challenges and opportunities. So I'm going to frame diversity by really talking about things like disability status, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, and race and ethnicity. And even though we know that diversity, obviously, as this word cloud shows us, is a product of lots of different things, right? Our education, our values, our backgrounds, our experiences. But the research really focuses on these sort of big topics that we talk about. The other caveat I want to mention is that research on diversity in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors is really as Elizabeth described, at a very primitive stage. So much of the research I'll start talking about and the data I'll start talking about has been done pretty robustly in the private sector for businesses and firms. And what we know about that data is that it really impacts performance. And so diversity has pretty significant impacts on performance at the individual level, the group level, and the organizational level. And so I love this slide, sort of why do we care about diversity and collecting that data despite the challenges that is there. And we care about that because it impacts performance at the organizational level particularly. And so I want to turn to the slide that I think shows us what could be with our data. And this was done in a study by Copan et al., and I'm happy to share that link. And essentially, they looked at private firms. And so how does diversity impact group and team outcomes and then outcomes at the organizational level? And one thing that I think is so interesting is for the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors, we have looked at very few of these outcomes, particularly at the group and team level. I can't think of any research that in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors that has done that. But if we look at the outcome level, there's lots of research on how diversity affects things like turnover, employee turnover, or sector switching, which is some of the work I do. But there's very little research on things like organizational culture and how those things in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors in turn affect diversity. So we're at a really primitive stage, and I want to keep emphasizing that. So despite the fact that there's a lack of diversity research on giving, I do want to talk about the types of research that have been done about diversity in our sector, and then I'll talk about some of the data challenges and opportunities that we do have. So I'm going to give you sort of a few highlights of some research that I think is interesting that people have been doing, and I'll talk about the ways that they've done that with data. And so the first bullet here is a paper that's just recently come out that basically shows in arts organizations, African American CEOs are more likely to engage in advocacy, which is new data. They collected this data on their own, and this is a really significant paper, right, showing us that racial ethnicity characteristics matter in the executive directors or CEOs of nonprofits. And that aspect of leadership in nonprofit and philanthropic organizations has really been understudied. In fact, most of our research on diversity and performance outcomes has been studied at the board level, which is really important, and I'll talk about that in a few slides. I have a paper that looks at foundations and shows that stakeholder participation, which obviously changes the demographics of the people on a foundation board, increases the first-time and small grantees that actually get a grant. And so we know from previous research that nonprofits that are larger, that are more established in the community, tend to get grants, and it's sort of a winner-takes-all system. So I'm sort of thinking about, well, what happens if we change the demographics of the people that sit on foundation boards? And so I have a paper that found that out. I think a really interesting paper that's been done was looking at sexual orientation and looked at gay men with HIV and how they preferred a doctor who was gay, and they discussed more private medical information, which obviously led to better outcomes for their health. And so we see that the idea of performance here is pretty broad when we're thinking about diversity in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. And then some colleagues and I have a paper that's sort of a work in progress and looks at the ways that age impacts why young people leave their sectors. And so we find that young nonprofit employees leave their sectors because of pay, and young public sector employees leave their sectors because of dissatisfaction. So here we see that age has an impact on turnover, but in different ways in each sector. And so these are sort of an overview of the types of research that are being done. And each of these studies has been done with different data sets, which is one of the real challenges in our sector. the data that exists on diversity is pretty nascent. The census data has been sort of used all the time by myself, by many scholars that are working on diversity issues. And as my presenters have said before me, the reason that the census and the ACS, the American Community Survey, have been used is because they're so robust. One of the most important things that these data sets include is sector. And many of the data sets that exist actually don't include sector. So it's very hard to figure out who are my nonprofit employees, who are my public sector employees, et cetera, et cetera. So if we're thinking about diversity issues, one of the challenges to our data sets and our ability to really link diversity to performance is that we don't have that sector. And so census data and ACS are really good examples of data that researchers and practitioners have used. Then, of course, there's 990 data, and the limitation here, of course, is that this data includes names of board members and executive directors, and there's sort of been a move toward identifying the gender identity and racial ethnicity of these board members and executive directors, and I can talk more about that in Q&A. And that's sort of the limit of the sort of national data sets that exist for examining diversity and performance. So I could write 15 slides on what data is missing, so let me give you some highlights. A significant portion of data that exists, that is missing, is the diversity of clients being served. So one really important question might be, how does the diversity of your staff, of your board, impact the types of clients that you see? And we actually don't have much data on which clients are being served in terms of all these demographic variables I talked about on the first slide. We also don't know where clients are being served, so we don't have zip code data on clients, which could actually link us to other data sets, as Eric mentioned. So this is a significant piece of the performance puzzle with diversity that we don't have. As I said, some people are doing some efforts around race and ethnicity and gender by using names of board members, but the racial and ethnic diversity of leadership in terms of executive directors and CEOs and boards is really at the nascent stage. And so the paper that I mentioned about advocacy and arts organization is really sort of rare because most of the research centers on boards and board performance. We have, I don't know of any paper, and maybe my colleagues can correct me, but I don't know of any paper looking at disability status, which tends to be called sort of a hidden diversity because many people don't self-report that. And if they do, there's obviously no way to link that to performance and what would that look like. And finally, we're really understudied in terms of thinking about sexual orientation and performance. And these are sort of the categories of diversity that have really been understudied in our sector, and not just to giving, but to any sort of performance indicators that we might think. So some other challenges, but maybe some hope in these categories, are that there's definitely a lack of robustness in our existing data sets. So many times scholars have to link census with a survey or a one-off survey with 990 data. And so there's not robustness in one data set to answer the sort of critical questions about diversity and performance that many scholars and practitioners have. As I mentioned before, many existing data sets don't have sector. I just started working with a data set that the Department of Education puts out, and it follows young people through their careers, which is questions that I'm interested in, and they don't have sector. So this is one example where even though there are many national data sets, many of them don't have sort of critical variables that are necessary to ask these questions. And I think there's some sort of hope in this last bullet point, which is that there's a lack of sharing between practitioners and scholars and vice versa. And this would help, of course, scholars answer more robust questions, but it would also help you as a practitioner answer questions that you need to maybe develop some advocacy within your organization to hire someone, or maybe to develop different programming or specialized programming. And I think there's some hope in this. So I have an example from a colleague of mine, Kelly LaRoe, who's at University of Illinois, Chicago, and she's really interested in the ways that nonprofits can help mobilize voters. And so she essentially got a grant to pay a few nonprofits in the area to help mobilize voters, help get messaging out, help register voters. And this is an example where nonprofits and scholars are working together to help advance practice, to help advance policy, and to help advance research. So I think there's some hope here, and I hope that we can start some conversations around some of these sort of big ideas that I presented. Thanks so much.
That's terrific, Jasmine. Thanks so much. And I find it just fascinating how, all three presenters really talked about multiple ways in which multiple questions, if you will, that more data is necessary to answer those questions. And these are not small questions. These are really vital questions to how things get done in communities, particularly for those who are most in need in those communities. And I think that the number of questions both about donors, about recipient communities, about nonprofit organizations themselves, and on and on and on. Those are really, I think, impress upon us the size of the challenge that we're facing. So we have some 3 questions now, one for each of the 3 presenters, and then there's a couple others that are sort of general questions. If you all do have questions, please type them into the chat box. But I'm going to start with a question for you, Elizabeth. There's a question that says, donors now fall tax-wise into 3 groups: non-itemizers, people who still will itemize after the new tax law, and those who used to itemize but won't do so now under the new law. Do you have a sense? I know you mentioned in one slide the sense of the number of people who will still itemize an estimate, but do you have a sense of how big each of these groups are so that people on the call know how many taxpayers fit into each of those groups? And if I could take the moderator's prerogative and add to the question and say, do we know that much about those who never itemized before? Given the size of these groups, what are the sort of data challenges with knowing each of those different 3 groups and how they're going to respond to this with their giving? So Elizabeth, that question's to you.
Thanks, Michael. I think basically we do surveys, I guess, and public studies of income dynamics, et cetera, to learn about non-itemizers. We always have to estimate, and I think our estimation procedures have gotten better over time, but we have to estimate their giving based on other data sources. I think they're about, the latest thing I saw was in 2014, 139.6 million taxpayers, and the slide that I showed you showed that itemized taxpayers who itemized their deductions was about 37 million, and it's estimated to decline to about 16 million. So that's the best information I have. My economist friend, Gene Sterling, probably could rattle that off at the top of his head. But it's always been a challenge. We don't know, actually, and this is going to be a challenge for us, how many folks will actually take the standard deduction. It's much easier, and it will benefit a lot of folks. So we'll have to keep an eye on this, and the Tax Policy Center will be modeling behavior as data comes in. So I can try to find out more precise information. That's the best I can do now.
Great, that is helpful, and I think part of the answer is that these things are going to be changing, and we won't know until we get the data on the next after the tax day next year to know just how many people fall into those groups. Yeah. So there's a question here that's directed at either Eric or Jasmine. I'll let Eric give the first response, and Jasmine, if you want to jump in. So do you have a recommendation on messaging to those hard-to-count populations when it comes to participating in the census, especially those who might be afraid of the repercussions of sharing their information? I imagine the citizenship question is a big part of this, of course.
Yeah, that is a very difficult thing to work on, especially considering the changing nature of the concerns, right? So this citizenship question is very new in terms of it's suddenly being added, and it's an untested question in terms of being added to the census. And in terms of recommendations for messaging, we have to remind people that census data and really a lot of federal statistics are collected under the assurances of protections in terms of the protections of the confidentiality of the respondents from Title 13. These data cannot be used for any enforcement purposes. But when we're doing that messaging, we also have to be very cognizant of the concerns of the communities that we're dealing with, because the concerns of these communities are very real. So we really have to think about the nuanced nature of the particular community that we're talking to. But these data are protected. They cannot be used for enforcement purposes. And really, I can point to the work in particular that's going on in Michigan right now with the Michigan Nonprofit Association, who is really taking a lead. And they have developed a complete count committee, and they're working on reaching out to these particular communities and the concerns that these communities have at the local level. And I think that's very important.
Jasmine, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that Eric said. And I want to bring up another point, which is that, research shows time and time again that nonprofits are sort of trusted in local communities. And as Eric said, there are obviously protections, right? But as a nonprofit, there's an opportunity there to really reach out to your clients, your beneficiaries, your local community, because they trust you. They trust your message. And so crafting a message about the protections, about how important this data might be for resources in their community, you might actually have an advantage as a nonprofit in communicating that information.
Great, that's great. Thanks. I think there's a question here that would probably be interesting for both Elizabeth and Jasmine to weigh in on. It says, what types of information and data do you think specifically should be shared better between practitioners and scholars? We've talked about this kind of link between, obviously scholars are interested in particular kinds of information, but practitioners can make use of that information in very effective ways, and that's in some ways the consequence of having the data gap is the consequences for practice. So I wonder if you could talk about, what are those kinds of information that you think are best for us to encourage practitioners and scholars to be sharing? I don't know if, Elizabeth, you have a thought on that to start.
Well, obviously, such things as the panel data project that scholars are trying to get off the ground now, they're going to be asking nonprofits to be responding to surveys, which are going to be uniform with the same questions going from community to community, and really stepping up to the plate and helping us to gather that information will be really important. And it probably will include information around diversity and topics that folks sometimes don't like to talk about, finances, giving, donors, etc. But if you can be open and share that information with us, I think that would be really important. Another thing that I'd like to see more of, and nonprofits can help us, many scholars have worked in the nonprofit sector, it's true, but we often don't have, we're not in the trenches day to day. And what I like to do when I'm developing a survey is sit down with some nonprofits and talk to them about, have I got this right? Am I wording it correctly? What am I missing? So being open to helping us to craft our instruments so that they really speak to the issues, and also letting us know what's on your mind. What do you need information for the practical side of how data can help? Those are my thoughts.
Jasmine, any quick thoughts on that? I know you mentioned it in your presentation, this need for sharing data.
Yeah, I echo what Elizabeth said, and it's true that many of us are former practitioners, including myself, and so we really want to be relevant, right? The other thing that I want to mention is that, I've heard from certain researchers that when they go to local communities that they have, what's been termed survey fatigue, that in fact, many researchers and many practitioners are constantly asking questions. And so those sort of like on-the-ground details would really help. I mean, I'm so interested in, also I just want to say I'm so interested in like what's what's happening with clients and who you're serving and how to start measuring that. And I think that's such a significant piece of information that we are missing, and it would be so helpful to, as Elizabeth said, participate in that panel project, which has a lot of questions about clients and things like that. But also, when we reach out and when we ask for help, that I hope we can do this in a way that's participatory and helpful for both practitioners in helping your beneficiaries and helping maybe direct more resources, and also helpful for scholars as well.
I think it's a really a good summary comment of the importance of it, but also the challenges. I think it's the challenges, of course, of the transparency of data, releasing data on things that sometimes can be sensitive. It's great data to have, but it's also difficult to provide. So we're going to turn then to our final thoughts, which we're going to give each of the presenters a chance to give a sort of a quick 1-minute final thought on this question specifically of what are the consequences of this data gaps that we've been talking about today. So if each of the presenters could, and I'm going to go in reverse order from Jasmine, Eric, and then Elizabeth, you could talk about what is the one consequence of the data gap that most concerns you, and then what would be something that you would suggest that we could do to try to avoid this problem or mitigate that impact or consequence. So Jasmine, first to you.
I think the biggest consequence that I can think of is that we will either rely on data from other sectors to guide us in terms of our practices, in terms of what we do in certain situations, or we will rely on sort of one-off studies or surveys, things like that, and those can obviously lead to misguiding us in different directions. I truly think the hope for us is in these collaborations between practitioners and scholars. So I've participated in one of these. I worked with YNPN, which is Young Nonprofit Professionals Network, and it was awesome. They had this membership data, and they sort of had done a little with it, and I worked with them. I produced something for their members. I produced more robust data on some trends that they were looking at, and I think this is in the hope. I think so many practitioners are producing data, lots and lots of data, and so the question becomes sort of how can we work together to help each other? And I think that's my hope for the future of this data collection that we've been talking about. Thanks for having me, Michael.
Wonderful. Thanks again, Jasmine. So Eric, to you, what's the one impact that you're most concerned about, and what can we do to avoid it?
Well, the thing that I'm most concerned about is probably the issue surrounding the federal data sets, right? So in terms of being properly funded, and that they continue to be a high quality and very robust source of data for this community and really everybody that really wants to understand the world around them. And what we can do is make sure that we're paying attention, right? In terms of these data, the Census Bureau does quarterly program review webinars that they talk about the progress that they're moving along. When our representatives are talking about funding data collection, make sure that they understand that we support those collection procedures, and make sure that if we feel like that there needs to be that there is a gap in the data that we're not getting answers for, push the agency whatever federal agency would have responsibility for that to make sure that they're telling the Census Bureau that they need those data, because as I said before, these data are not collected because somebody at the Census Bureau or whatever federal agency wants to collect the data or thinks it would be a good idea. It's because there's a need for the data, and they've been asked to collect it.
Great. Thanks again for doing this today, Eric. And then finally, Elizabeth, so what's the consequence that most concerns you, and what can we do about it, other than, of course, having foundations give a lot more money for more data collection on nonprofits?
Well, that, of course, is a number one idea. But I think what worries me is about the marginalization of the nonprofit sector. Without robust data, you really don't know the role and the status and how the nonprofit organizations and philanthropy fit into the national narrative. It affects our knowledge and our ability to plan and sustain organizations. So I worry that if we don't have robust information and our infrastructure, our data infrastructure is not well funded, we rely on a lot of these federal data sets, so that's a chief concern as well, but that we run the risk of becoming invisible again.
Great. I think that's a really terrific point for us to end on, because it does, it really emphasized the importance of this challenge. It's not simply if you will, in the old phrase, an academic question. It is a real has real major consequences for our communities. So we want to thank, first of all, to all three of the presenters for such a terrific job in touching on a number of different aspects of this. We want to thank everybody who was on the call. And we want to encourage you to connect both with the Johnson Center and specifically with our effort, which we're calling Field Focus. That's going to be a thematically focused effort for a few months at a time. So April, May, and June, we're focused on this specific question of data and its use in the sector. There's blog posts and other things that you can find there at that link, Johnson Center Field Focus. And just one final reminder that everybody, there will be an evaluation coming your way. We really would like you to fill that out and give us more input, and we hope to see you on future webinars with the Johnson Center. And a final thank you to our three presenters, and thanks to everybody for being on the call. Have a great day.